many natives had a penchant for agriculture. Chapter 4. For this chapter, Filipinos, according to Rizal, are not to blame for their misfortunes because they are not their own masters. The Spanish government has not encouraged labor or trade, which has ceased as a result of the government's treatment of the country's neighboring trade partners with great suspicion. Furthermore, trade has declined due to pirate attacks and the many restrictions imposed by the government, which provides no aid to crops or farmers. Many government officials own businesses. There is widespread red tape and bribery, and the government tolerates rampant gambling. This situation is exacerbated by the Church's incorrect doctrine, which holds that the rich will not go to heaven, resulting in a negative attitude toward work. Native Americans have also faced educational discrimination. These are some of the primary reasons cited by Rizal for the deterioration of Filipino values. Next slide, please. Yet, the continuous exploitation of the farmers and their produce to merely feed the mouths of those who rule over them without mercy has led the soil to be impoverished. But then again, Rizal tries to remedy our sadness by diverting the blame on the Spaniards and their way of handling our country and ourselves as citizens. Ultimately, we are consigned to accept our fate.
We recognize the causes that awoke the predisposition and provoked the evil. Now let us see what foster and sustain it. In this connection, government and governed have to bow our heads and say, we deserve our fate. We have already truly said that when a house becomes disturbed and disordered, we should not accuse the youngest child or the servants, but the head of it, especially if his authority is unlimited. He who does not act freely is not responsible for his actions, and the Filipino people, not being master of its liberty, is not responsible for either its misfortunes or its woes. We says this, it is true, but, as will be seen later on, we also have a large part in the continuation of such a disorder. The following, among other causes, contributed to foster the evil and aggravate it: the constantly lessening encouragement that labor has met with in the Philippines. Fearing to have the Filipinos deal frequently with other individuals of their own race, who were free and independent, as the Borneans, the Siamese, the Cambodians, and the Japanese, people who in their customs and feelings differ greatly from the Chinese, the government acted toward these others with great mistrust and great severity, as Morga testifies in the last pages of his work, until they finally ceased to come to the country. In fact, it seems that once an uprising planned by the Borneans was suspected, we say suspected, for there was not even an attempt, although there were many executions. And, as these nations were the very ones that consumed Philippine products, when all communication with them had been cut off, consumption of these products also ceased. The only two countries with which the Philippines continued to have relations were China and Mexico, or New Spain, and from this trade only China and a few private individuals in Manila got any benefit. Fact, the Celestial Empire sent her junks laden with merchandise, that merchandise which shut down the factories of Seville and ruined the Spanish industry, and returned laden in exchange with the silver that was every year sent from Mexico. Nothing from the Philippines at that time went to China, not even gold, for in those years the Chinese traders would accept no payment but silver coin. To Mexico went little more, some cloth and dry goods which the encomenderos took by force or bought from the natives at a paltry price, wax, amber, gold, civet, etc., but nothing more, and not even in great quantity, as is stated by Admiral Don Geronimo de Banuelos y Carrillo, when he begged the king that the inhabitants of the Manilas be permitted to load as many ships as they could with native products, such as wax, gold, perfumes, ivory, cotton cloths, which they would have to buy from the natives of the country. Thus the friendship of those peoples would be gained, they would furnish New Spain with their merchandise, and the money that is brought to Manila would not leave this place. The coastwise trade, so active in other times, had to die out, thanks to the piratical attacks of the Malays of the south, and trade in the interior of the islands almost entirely disappeared, owing to restrictions, passports and other administrative requirements. Of no little importance were the hindrances and obstacles that from the beginning were thrown in the farmers' way by the rulers, who were influenced by childish fear and saw everywhere signs of conspiracies and uprisings. The natives were not allowed to go to their labors, that is, their farms, without permission of the governor, or of his agents and officers, and even of the priests, as Morga says. Those who know the administrative slackness and confusion in a country where the officials work scarcely 2 hours a day, those who know the cost of going to and returning from the capital to obtain a permit, those who are aware of the petty retaliations of the little tyrants will well understand how with this crude arrangement it is possible to have the most absurd agriculture. True it is that for some time this absurdity, which would be ludicrous had it not been so serious, has disappeared, but even if the words have gone out of use, other facts and other provisions have replaced them. The moral pirate has disappeared, but there remains the outlaw who infests the fields and waylays the farmer to hold him for ransom. Now then, the government, which has a constant fear of the people, denies to the farmers even the use of a shotgun, or if it does allow it does so very grudgingly and withdraws it at pleasure, whence it results with the laborer, who, thanks to his means of defense, plants his crops and invests his meager fortune in the furrows that he has so laboriously opened, that when his crop matures, it occurs to the government, which is impotent to suppress brigandage, to deprive him of his weapon, and then, without defense and without security, he is reduced to inaction and abandons his field, his work, and takes to gambling as the best means of securing a livelihood. The green cloth is under the protection of the government, it is safer. A mournful counselor is fear, for it not only causes weakness but also in casting aside the weapons strengthens the very persecutor. The sordid return the native gets from his work has the effect of discouraging him. We know from history that the encomenderos, after reducing many to slavery and forcing them to work for their benefit, made others give up their merchandise for a trifle or nothing at all, or cheated them with false measures. Speaking of Ipian, in Panay, Padre Gaspar de San Agustin says, it was in ancient times very rich in gold. But provoked by the annoyances they suffered from some governors, they have ceased to get it out, preferring to live in poverty than to suffer such hardships. Further on, speaking of other towns, he says, goaded by the ill treatment of the encomenderos who in administering justice have treated the natives as their slaves and not as their children, and have only looked after their own interests at the expense of the wretched fortunes and lives of their charges.
Thank you, Cariz. The moral pirate has disappeared, but the bandit remains, infesting the farms and waiting to kidnap the farmer for a ransom. The government, which constantly fears the people, denies all the farmers even the use of a rifle, or if it does allow it, makes its acquisition very difficult and withdraws it at pleasure. Then, without a means to defend himself, he is reduced to inaction and indulges in gambling as a means of gaining a livelihood. The gambling table is under government protection. It is safer. The miserly return that a Filipino gets from his labor would in the end discourage him. Through the historians, we learn that the encomenderos, after reducing many to slavery and compelling them to work for their benefit, made the rest sell them their products at an insignificant price or for nothing, or cheated them with false measures. Speaking about in Panay, Father G. de San Agustin says, it was formerly very rich in gold, but irked by the vexations they receive from some provincial governors, they have ceased getting it, preferring to live in poverty than to suffer such hardships. Further on, speaking of other towns, he says, they were irritated by the bad treatment of the encomenderos, who in the administration of justice had treated them more like slaves than and their children, and they only look after their own interests at the expense of the modest fortunes and lives of their charges. In Leyte, where they wanted to kill an encomendero of the town of Tagani for the great vexations that he was causing them, demanding for a tribute of blocks which he weighed on a false balance he himself has made. This state of affairs has lasted a long time and still exists, despite the fact that the breed of encomenderos has become existing. A name is gone, but the vice and passions do not disappear while reforms merely change names. The wars with the Dutch and the invasions and piracy of the Jolowans and Mindanaos have ended. The people have been transformed, new towns have arisen, while others have become impoverished. But surviving are the vexations and the frauds, as much as, if not worse than, in those early years. We will not cite our own experience, for aside from the fact that we don't know which to select, critical individuals may reproach us with being partial, neither will we cite those of other Filipinos who write for the newspapers. No, we will confine ourselves to translating the words of a modern French traveler who stayed in the Philippines for a long time. He says, referring to the rosy picture of the Philippines given him by a member of a religious order, had not told me of the governor, or which we called Alcalde Mayor, the highest functionary of the district, who is so busy with enriching himself that he has no time to tyrannize his docile subjects. The governor, in charge of administering the country and collecting the various taxes in the name of the government, devotes himself almost entirely to business. For him, the high and noble functions of his office are nothing more than instruments of personal gain. The monopolizes all business, and instead of stimulating around him love of work, instead of curbing the very natural indolence of the natives, of using his authority, he thinks of nothing else but of destroying all competition which might bother him or attempt to share his profits. Little does it matter if the country is impoverished, is without education, without trade, without industry, provided the governor gets rich quickly. The traveler, however, has been unfair in picking out particularly the government. Why the government only? We are not quoting passages from the writings of other travelers, because we don't have their works before us and we don't want to quote from memory. The great difficulty that every enterprise encountered with the administration and also contributed not a little to kill off every commercial or industrial movement in the Philippines. All the Filipinos who have wished to engage in business know how many documents, how many comings and goings, how many patients are necessary to secure from the government a permit for an enterprise. One must count on the good will of this one, on a good bribe to another, so that he would not begin whole the application. One must pray to God to give him good humor and time to look for it over, and above all, much patience, a great knowledge of how to get along, plenty of money, much politics, many bows, complete resignations. How strange it is that the Philippines should remain poor despite its very fertile soil, when history tells us that the most flourishing countries today date their development and well-being from the day they got their liberty and civil rights. The most commercial and most industrious countries have been the freest countries. France, England, and the United States prove this. Hong Kong, which is not worth the most insignificant island of the Philippines, has more commercial activity than all our islands put together because it is free and well governed. Trading with China, which was the whole occupation of the colonizer of the Philippines, was not only prejudicial to Spain but also to the life of their colonies. The government officials and private citizens of Manila, finding an easy means of enriching themselves, neglected everything. They did not see to it that the land is cultivated, nor did they encourage industry. They had a trade with China, and all they had to do was to take advantage of it and gather the gold that dropped from Mexico to the interior of the Celestial Empire, and allies from which it is not coming out again. Filipinos' aversion to activity and hatred or fear of work is reflected in their manners, which have been translated into Tila Castilla, or You Are Like a Spaniard, by the Spanish writer Placido Domingo. The pernicious influence of the rulers that of surrounding themselves with servants